My name is Daniel Karlsson. Since you see three names there, and one of them is a non-Swedish speaking person, we decided to kind of take this in English. But as usual, you're allowed to ask questions in Swedish, and we'll try to translate. At least we can try. So I've given the interesting task here because we have all these excellent presentations here about the beauty of this idea of archetypes, and I'm beginning the task to show how complex this could be and to make things more problematic. That is something that I usually enjoy. But I'm also very fond of the work that has been shown earlier here, that OpenAir is doing and that we're doing in Norway. So I'll try to constrain myself somewhat. So I'm going to talk today about terminology, clinical models combined, and then Erik will continue with queries. And Heather she has promised she would ask rude questions during the presentation when I least suspect it. So this is something that we already have heard from numerous presenters, but we have the terminologies on one hand, and that this is any terminology. This is not just about SNOMED CD. This is about ICD and KVO and ICF and whatever and all those micro terminologies that exist there in every information system, man, woman, breakfast, things like that. They all do require to be put in some kind of context. So you need to specify who's the patient, or is it the patient or the patient's neighbor or the patient's neighbor's wife or something else. Who is the subject of this piece of information that is denoted by this code or this term or phrase or whatever. Also need to specify when and where, when did it happen, was it yesterday, was it 3 years ago, and so on. So terminology cannot be used in a vacuum. You need something else to put those terms, codes, whatever, classes, things. You need somewhere to put them. Clinical information models, as we've seen, they require some kind of reusable patterns, or it would become unmanageable. And one such kind of reusable pattern is things that are typically done by terminologies, and where terminologies are quite good, actually. So we have the 10,000 codes in ICD-10 for diagnosis. We have the approximately 15,000 MPU codes used in laboratory medicine in, for example, Sweden and Norway. And we have I just counted them, 102,000 approximately clinical findings in SNOMED. So there is something that we don't want to repeat with archetypes. We don't want 102,000 problem diagnosis archetypes, where one would probably be sufficient for most cases. So it's clinical models and terminology, not either or something. So and I think that's already been established by the previous speakers. But then just to show some issues, we have a SNOMED code here, 440540006. It's diabetes mellitus type 2. You could look it up if you don't believe me. But if you find this code in a medical record, you have to consider what this really mean in terms of its context. So is it a diagnosis? Is it a risk? Is it someone else's history? Or is it an exclusion? So, for example, we have a problem diagnosis archetype here, and this is barely visible, but there you see this diabetes mellitus type 2 code appearing, and there is a slot for that code there up in the thing called problem diagnosis inside the problem diagnosis archetype. So this is the archetype. So here we see that there is a structure which provides context to the meaning of this. So this probably means, well, there is some date, time, specification. You saw in Celia's presentation that the subject of care could be specified using reference model elements. So this is a way of specifying the meaning of this diabetes mellitus SNOMED CD code so that it becomes something that is meaningful in a clinical setting. But that's not the only thing. There are other ways of using the same code. So, for example, there is a family history archetype, which has a lot of stuff there. But then there is a problem diagnosis field there as well. And if we put the same code 44054006 in that slot there, then the meaning becomes different. And this is now a family history of diabetes mellitus type 2. So there is someone else specified with this. So yet again, this is some kind of structure which gives the context that makes this SNOMED code clinically meaningful. And another example. So this is more the same. We have an exclusion of problem diagnosis. We have this is becoming, it's the same name of the slot being used in different contexts. We put the same code in and we get yet something different with a different clinical meaning. So this is all fine. It seems like we have the roles of these resources. We have the terminologists there, and we have the archetypes there, and you have the ones are for providing the diagnosis, the problems, and one is for providing the context. And then there are things like this. So it's just that SNOMED has its own model for describing at least something similar to what the archetypes are doing. And this is an example, if you remember from Mika's presentation, how to read these diagrams. We have a concept for this I invented myself. It doesn't really exist in SNOMED, but no diabetes mellitus type 2, and it's a kind of clinical finding abset, which is a situation in the situation part of SNOMED CD, maybe not the brightest part of SNOMED, but anyhow, it has an associated finding, and it's the same code. You will remember that code when you wake up in the night screaming after this day. So there is an overlap between these these resources we have available for representing content, and if there's an overlap, then there is some kind of coordination needed. I'll show you another example just because, so that you would see the scope of the problem and the width and the depth of the problem. So this is the terminology used for reporting lab tests in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. It's the MPU terminology, and this has a number of blood glucose tests, and these have, for example, they have this one that tells that it's blood, this glucose, substance concentration, and the unit of millimole per liter. And some of them, they have the time specified, and this is in this context means the time after a challenge. But then there is a blood glucose archetype, an entire archetype just about blood glucose instead of all these. So, well, at least one idea would be to take the most generic blood glucose MPU code and put that there. So that's MPU 02187 and put that in the test name slot of the blood glucose archetype. And you see that there's a timing part, some specification of the glucose challenge here. So you could say after 30 minutes. And then you have the unit, which is actually hidden deep inside the results there. So again, there is an overlap here. You see the terminology has one way of specifying things and the archetype has one way. And then you think that, okay, so let's just decide and make the decision that we either use this one or that way. But then there are even trickier things. So problem diagnosis model again. So SNOMED code is intertrochanteric fracture. It's a fracture of the part of the femur. And the problem here is that this one is defined in terms of the location of the fracture. So this is intrinsic to SNOMED-CT. SNOMED-CT wouldn't be what it would be without SNOMED-CT using these specifications, location specifications, or finding sites that Mikael were talking about. Those are actually used to build the structures, and if you would remove them, you would more or less make SNOMED-CT unmanageable and eventually unusable. So that is necessary. But here is a body site, and there are various ways of specifying. You could even have more specific details. So potentially identifying the site of the fracture by making a mark on an X-ray plate, well, digital X-ray image. So these things, the specification of the body site is a necessary component, at least in some cases, of both SNOMED-CT in this example and in the archetype. So we have some really interesting coordination problems to consider. So we have what has been called the boundary problem. So we have terminologies on the one side, and ideally they make always universally true statements about kinds of things. So diabetes, the terminology would say that diabetes mellitus type 2 is a kind of disease of the endocrine system, and you could look into SNOMED and see that that's the way it's described there. Whereas clinical models are kind of information scope statements. So what should be recorded in a given situation, and that actually looks kind of different. But this is unfortunately an ideal picture, and in reality it's rather more than like this. You saw the three circles on this one. Yeah, here. So what I'm showing on this slide is actually those two, the blue and the green circles dragged out and reshaped into a rectangle instead. So one potential issue with these Venn diagrams is that it doesn't show the fuzziness of these circles. Whereas we've seen examples here. We have the diagnosis, some procedures, lab tests where there are thousands of things, probably thousands of very similar things. Probably the terminology is the best solutions, and we've seen some good examples where we really need these clinical models, the archetypes things. But there is a gray area in between, which will require will require further experiences, which are documented, and then we eventually, hopefully, will develop a larger understanding, and we might reach a situation where we have a much smaller gray area than we had before. But there are some intrinsically interesting cases. So, for example, the different use cases will have different requirements. There's a difference between clinical domains, how they look at these things, documenting. So something that is the primary diagnosis for one is a comorbidity for another one, and so on. So there could be different recording requirements, which could be different from the reuse requirements, and so on. So what is being done here in this space? There are some standards being developed for terminology use inside these clinical models, clinical information models. Unfortunately, the list is not that long. There is, as far as I know, there is only one published standard, and that is published by the HL7 standards organization. There is work being done in other standards group, but I haven't seen really the output yet. And they have a document called Using SNOMED CT in CDA R2, and for those of you who know what that means, for those of you who don't, CDA is just I will come back to that in a few minutes, but it's basically a way of expressing clinical models. There's been various experiments. There's been a European Union project called Semantic HealthNet. They have considered whether it would be possible to take these things described in SNOMED and detect the equivalences. So if something is clinical finding absence seems kind of similar to having exclusion archetype, and this problem is the same as that one there, the associated finding. So there might be some possibilities, but this would require that there is at least some way that you could identify the parts in SNOMED and find the equivalent parts in the archetype, and this is probably going to be the exception rather than the rule. So basically, we're facing a challenge when it comes to using terminologies in clinical models, but there is no way of avoiding this because we need both. We just need to get started in attacking this problem, documenting our findings and gathering experiences. Okay, thank you.
Any short questions? Questions regarding this? It's a bit of a complex area. Could you say that you could use an archetype to kind of decide what to do in that gray area for this moment and then change your mind later?
A nice thing about archetypes is that they allow the specification of how terminology. We haven't actually showed. We only showed these diagrams with bullets, with arrows and boxes and so on. But there's actually a technical corresponding real thing happening there, where there is just diagrams now. But you could specify how terminology is bound in the archetype, and so you could consider an archetype like a terminology binding contract. Problem is that you need to apply these whatever principles there are consistently over all archetypes, and I think that's the main challenge.
To work in a disciplined way.
Yeah, and with a tool-supported disciplined way.
Yes. And that's a thing we're coming back to often, that just sitting there drawing images or writing Word files, then you don't always see that this Word document really doesn't match up with this other Word document, what we've said there. So actually using concrete tools like this is good. We're going to show a little bit of another tool. Now we're a bit short of time, so I'll do the slide version instead. There is, you can do queries. You saw wrong we're doing things. So this is actually a real tool where you can take something and move over and create a query. But I'll just go over to slide version instead. It's from another vendor. And this is about clinicians should be able to use tools to I have one already. To formulate queries. And then we could have the technical people could do this fun thing of making algorithms, converting them to these SQL and XQuery and these things. I've done that. That's great fun. But that's not something that we should ask the clinicians to do. And you can read about different ways of storing OpenAir and all that stuff. So you should have some kind of tool that makes some kind of query that you kind of can understand and execute. So here we have the archetype that Heather created this morning. I just took that as an example. So you open it up in a tool that is made for creating queries, and then you get a list here of different things, and you can pull that into here. And then so here it's inside a composition, and then there's a blood pressure in there, and then we select the magnitude of the blood pressure. So that's one thing we want to get out there, and then we could pick out this examination of eye, for example. We could say that it should not be any abnormality detected. This is a really, from a clinical perspective, a really crazy question, so we should probably make one afterwards with a real clinician. So if this is true and that is true, then I want to execute this and get the patients that fulfill these criteria. It should be possible for clinicians to do this. Maybe they would need to talk to someone else before they can run this towards the entire population. But for things in your clinic, it shouldn't be too hard, not too intensive on the database queries. And then when you do a query like this, you find out, oh, I need to reformulate it a little bit. And nowadays we often have, when we want to get data extraction, it takes a couple of weeks. You make an order, I want statistics of this, and then someone sits down, tries to formulate it in a way, and then you get the results back a couple of weeks later, if you're lucky. Otherwise, it could be rejected, or you get it even later. But this is still good people doing good work, but they have a lot of things to do. It should be something that clinicians should be able to do. And then when you've used a tool like this, then you get it into some kind of form like this, and now we're getting closer to what's running in the computer. But this, with a day of training or so, you could understand these things and edit them and adjust them. And this is not too difficult. You select these values from an electronic health record that contains a composition that has these contents where these values have these criteria, and then you sort them in a special way. This is not rocket science. Clinicians can do that, and they are often interested in their data. And then you push a button and you get it translated to this OpenAir language-independent stuff here. You say AT something, whatever. This is because inside the OpenAir archetypes, you have numbers instead of text. Now we've gotten some leading text here to make it easier in the tool. That's because we're going to be able to write a query using a Swedish tool, and then we can execute it towards Portuguese health records if you want to. Also, these queries can be language independent. Unless, of course, you're trying to ask for something that is in a free text field. You won't get OpenAir to automatically translate your free text fields. But everything that has been selected in archetypes like this, discrete values you can get. And now I think we could look closer at that later, but we'll let Daniel jump in on a little bit about what's happening internationally here, and we'll get the computers to jump over again. Any questions about this with queries? I know some of you would like to run queries on your EHR data. Do you have any questions? Does it sound like a good idea to be able to formulate them yourself? Yeah, someone's really naughty. Okay.
Now it's only me, and I've been given yet another interesting task. I was going to make a summary of what's happening internationally in 10 minutes or so. And I will probably fail miserably, but you could ask questions afterwards. So the clinical model international landscape, there are several standard organizations and national programs doing this and regional programs as well. And if you compare this, for example, with what we were seeing in the terminology space, we have a much smaller number of, and the convergence is a bit larger than in the, and probably this is due to this fact that terminologies deal with universal truths, and these information model, clinical model groups, they have to deal with what people, clinicians want to record, which is a bit more complex question. So, given this, I will make a very, 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 very short overview of at least some things that happen now. So we heard it mentioned before. This thing called HL7. It's originally an American organization. Stands for Health Level 7. I won't explain the meaning. But they started in the 80s developing, well, probably earlier than, because this is version 2 in 87. So sometimes in the 80s they started developing messaging models, and this you should also make note of that this is kind of different. And as Heather explained before, that whereas OpenAir is looking into the structure inside the HR, and at the source, HL7 has mainly been limited to communication between different systems. So they started in 1987 with something called HL7 version 2. It's been updated a number of times since, but this is the most used standard today. So there is 95% of US caregivers are using this HL7 version 2 standard, and at least they claim themselves that it's used in more than 35 countries. But this is largely a technical standard, so it specifies how to communicate, but doesn't really specify the meaning of what's going into there. So this would rely on external sources like terminologies for specifying the meaning of the message. Then about 10 years later, they tried to address this problem with the next version, HL7 version 3. And the new thing here is that they had something called a reference information model, which probably you could use a Lego metaphor here as well, but I wouldn't like to do that because it's a very different kind of Lego metaphor as compared to, or at least sufficiently different from the one that Heather presented. But the idea here is that you have a number of blocks and or pieces, and everything that can ever be expressed should be expressed in terms of those blocks and nothing else. So that was the idea, and there was some development here in the meantime, because this was at the beginning quite complex to implement. But then some new technology came around, late 90s, this thing called XML, and they did basically something called clinical document architecture, which is still mainly a messaging format, even though it's called document. Anyhow, so that was mainly based on this reference information model, but used a different technology there. I'm not describing every detail here, so. And then something happened here in just a couple of years ago, because there was this was still a bit found to be a bit too complex to implement. So there was something within HL7 called Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, FHIR, it's pronounced. The idea here is that they updated the technology to like the technologies, the most recent technologies of today. They added some extensibility, so you could actually take the standard resource and do some kind of extension, which is kind of new compared to the other standards. And they also had it, so the reference information model was ditched. So they use these things called resources instead, which are not terribly different from the classes of the reference information model, but still a different name. That was a very short presentation of HL7, and then there came another thing. It originally started in 2011 at an HL7 meeting, and the discussion then was that they were not doing too well with CDA and V3, because as you remember from the previous slide, most users of HL7 standard are still using the HL7 version 2, the old standard. So there was a meeting, and there were actually a thing called Fresh Look, and there were some presentations, and Fire was actually another one of those. But Stan Huff from Intermountain Healthcare, which has been mentioned here before, he had a presentation about this thing he thought would be great, and there was some kind of cooperation between developers of these information models. So the idea was that you would develop a format for describing these models, and then you would invite everyone to provide their clinical models, and by using this common format you would at least facilitate the comparison between these. You could identify where the things were similar and where things were very different. So that's the general idea, but this group has also started developing a number of new models. They're using archetypes, and this variant of archetypes, version 2.0, has been developed jointly with CIMI and OpenAir and others. And they have also added a UML profile for making archetypes called AML, Archetype Modeling Language. So if you have that profile and import it to your UML tool, you could make archetypes using whatever UML tool you're using. So this has been freestanding from HL7, but just recently it became a HL7 Working Group. And they have a web page, opencimi.org, and you could read a bit more about. They have a repository of models as well, so you could have a look there. HL7 standards, you need to register to be able to download those standards. Yep. One last strand of standards development that I was going to mention was the 13606, and some of you, the thing that used to be an European standard, EN 13606, which later became an ISO standard, ISO 13606, and some of you might remember this from the NPÖ, Nationell Patientöversikt version 1, because part 1 of this standard was used in NPÖ version 1, but I assume it's not going to be used in version 2, at least what I've heard. There is now a revision ongoing, and the aim is to publish this in 2017. There will not be any change in scope, so these 5 parts will still remain with basically unchanged scope. The reference model part, that is part 1, that was the thing that was used in NPÖ, will be aligned. I put the line in quotation marks because I don't know what align means, because it could mean so many different things. So it should be aligned with open air and some selected fire resources. That's the idea, at least. Let's see what happens. So this was part 1. Part 2, that's the archetype model, and this is to be coordinated with open air and CIMI, and at least from what I've heard, this should probably be the version 2.0 of the archetype model. And this will also reference these ADL, the thing that Celia showed before, and this UML profile as well, as different ways of representing archetypes. Part 3, reference archetypes. There will be some coordination with some other existing standards. I don't know how many of you knows the CONSYS standard. There are, I think, 9 reference archetypes which should correspond to some core concepts from the CONSYS standard. And there should be some based on fire resources and possibly some top-level CIMI archetypes as well. But this remains to be seen. I think so, Helene, are you still involved? You might. So maybe you can provide even more detail than I can. So please ask Helene Broberg if you have more questions. Yeah. Okay, so this was my very short overview of what's happening internationally in this space. And now I could see if there is any questions. There are any questions.
Some questions. While they are thinking, could you say that now that archetypes are kind of used in several startups, using archetypes is not the big question for detailed models, it's more like which reference models to use the archetypes on?
So yeah, there is definitely some kind of convergence, but I think it's probably too early to say if this is I don't want to be negative, but it's I don't know if this is lip service or this is really something that is truly happening. But at least in these discussion rooms, on these conferences, there seems to be some convergence on using archetypes. And now that CIMI is a part of HL7, there is the archetype formalism has like sneaked into the HL7 standarding world as well. So that's kind of interesting, at least. And there is collaboration between fire, developing fire resources, and open air as well. So there is some hope out there.
Does it mean that HL7 will move from being message-based to information model-based?
No, so this is one working group out of many. So I don't think that it will have that impact.
I guess it depends on what their clients want to do. If the main clients do want to have their proprietary systems and just exchange snippets, then that's what they will likely focus on, like any other organization would. If the clients, the members, would really like to do detailed modeling inside the clinical systems and share that, then this could take off in another direction. So I guess it depends a little bit on business models of healthcare providers and of EHR providers, of the members. Yeah.